Hello, this is my first time reviewing anything on YouTube, but I recently read Under the Dome by Stephen King, and I had a few thoughts that I thought would be worth sharing, so I did a wee search around on YouTube, and a few people have done reviews on this book, but I think I've got some things to say that no one else has said. So I'm going to contribute to the discussion on the internet of this book by just giving some of my thoughts on Under the Dome by Stephen King. So the first thing I'm going to say is, spoilers beware. I think this is the kind of book where it's not really worthwhile talking about it unless you're going to talk about some of the plot points. Because if I were to restrict myself from not saying anything about the plot, I would effectively be able to say nothing. So I was going to start by saying why I bought this book, because I have a Kindle, so very often I try to download books on the cheap or get them for free if I can, by whatever means. But I was in a bookshop and I saw this book, and immediately the cover grabbed me. So I watched some reviews by people living in North America of this book, and the cover that's available to them seems to be different than what I've got. I live in the United Kingdom in Europe, and I suppose we would have some different covers, but this is what the cover of my copy looks like. So it's this very, very nice photo of this old man here, in don't know how it's showing up on the camera, but very bold colours, lovely green there, lovely blue, lovely reds on his shirt. So yeah, the cover grabbed me, got my interest, and I quite like the physicality of books, because I'm all up for Kindles and all that, but if you're going to spend more money on a physical book, it's cool to have one that looks nice, I think anyway. Also, I figured it's a big book, and if you buy a big book, you're getting more for your money. Everyone talks about the size of this book who reviews it, but it's big. Also, it's quite recent. I like my Stephen King, but I'm of the opinion, like a lot of people are, that he's only getting better as he writes more. So I figured if this is a more recent book, I'll be more up to speed on my Stephen King, but I'll probably be getting a better quality novel. So I figured a new Stephen King book that looks cool and is large is probably worth £9, which is what it cost me. Anyway, moving on. So, I'll just quickly list the other Stephen King stuff I've read, to give you an idea of the angle I'm coming at this book from. I've read Night Shift, his collection of short stories, and then everything else I've read by him is a novel. I've read Bag of Bones, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, Firestarter, Dreamcatcher, and From a Buick 8. So, a lot of those books deal with some similar things that Under the Dome dealt with. It's some of his old stuff, some of his new stuff. So I think I know a little bit about Stephen King. So, to summarise quickly what this book's about, it's set in a small town in Maine, like, to be honest, most of Stephen King's stuff. And I think the hardcore fans have been able to position this little fictional town in relation to some of his other little fictional towns, which is quite cool. Because Stephen King, he does a thing where all his books, including the ones in genres other than horror, seem to be set in the same little world, and they cross over a bit. It's quite cool. So anyway, there's this little town, and then basically one day a large transparent dome drops over it, a bit like in the Simpsons movie, and because of that lots of consequences start to unfold. So the main thing that the book concerns itself with is the power shift that occurs in the town. Basically there's this rather nasty corrupt local politician called Jim Rennie, and he seizes the opportunity of having this place cut off from any other higher authority to take all the power in the town and make it his own, and our heroes try and stop him. I've got a bunch of little subheadings here I'm reading from notes. So one of the first things that jumped out to me is this book, whether it would be considered literature or a summer read. These things concern me. I'm an English student studying in Manchester, and if something is considered literature, it's good for studying. If something is a summer read, you poo-poo it. And Stephen King, this is something people talk about a lot. He occupies something between literature, high art, and low culture, summer read, because his books are very readable. You don't need to be super intelligent, super literature minded to read them, but they are of a fairly high level of quality. This book, I think because it's long, he feels the need to deploy various techniques that keep you reading, kind of sneaky techniques. So numerous times in this novel, one character will reveal some important information or pass on an important plan to another character for things that are going to happen later in the book. But rather than giving you the details of the plan, rather than spelling out what the characters actually said, Stephen King will effectively just say the character said so and so to so and so. So if it was a cartoon, you would be hearing one character whispering and the other going. It is a little kind of cheap in the way it keeps you reading the book, but I think that works in a way. It keeps the pace fast, keeps you reading, and I don't think that's to Stephen King's discredit. It shows that he's able to keep up the quality of this book without degrading. It shows he has technique without at the same time keeping the quality high, and I think that's a balancing act, because you get some very long books that are considered literature, but they're awfully hard to read because they're very long, but the author doesn't debase themselves into considering their audience and writing something that deploys any kind of base technique to hold your attention. So anyway, I think this book continues the tradition of Stephen King treading the middle ground between being high-minded and being readable. Anywho, the next thing I was going to talk about was the origins of this book. Basically, this was a concept Stephen King had back in the 70s or the 80s. Anyways, an early point in his career where he had the idea of a dome or some kind of limitation dropping over a town. And he tried to write a novel and it didn't quite work, and he's finally come back to it now. Or you can treat it like it's kind of like reading an old Stephen King book, but set in modern times, which I think is interesting. But anyway, going on, other things Stephen King had to say about his book was, I think it was in it was the afterword, after the end of the book, where he talks about the commitment he felt he had to have to scientific accuracy. Because he knew that if you're going to drop a dome over a town in your novel, it's going to have certain kind of scientific consequences, and he felt he had a duty as an author, as I'm sure lots of authors would, to be as accurate in his portrayal of these consequences as possible. So the things that the consequences he kind of focuses on are the ecological ones. So basically, aside from resources being dwindling and the government being cut off from this little town, he also talks about, like I said earlier, the air starting to run out. And because everyone in the town has a little generator, because the Maine's electricity to the town runs out, and I think, as people often do in Maine, apparently, they've all got these little liquid petroleum generators, which means every single house is giving off carbon emissions, which dirties the air. And this isn't so bad on a global scale when we're driving around in our cars and that, it just goes into the air. But because they have this dome, every little stain on the dome gets recorded. And as you'd imagine, the smog and that builds up, and the dome gets dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. And I just think I'll talk about that later, but I think it's quite clever, because that's something I can't speak for everyone. I wouldn't have thought of ever to include that in a dome drops over a town scenario. But it just shows all this environmental stuff is going on all the time in the world, and you don't think of it, but do something in a novel as simple as dropping a transparent dome which can stain over a town, and it brings everything to the fore. So there was one thing I think Stephen King kind of skipped over in trying to be scientifically and technologically accurate. It seems like a nitpicky thing to say, but there's one little sequence where a clever young man in the town wants to record something that's happening and broadcast it by internet across the dome, and this is going to require a strong internet signal. And the government decide to help. They're contacting the town residents by phone. They decide to help out by boosting. Stephen King's words, I think, are mostly just something along the lines of, we're going to boost the Wi-Fi, and that seems to me to be a bit of a misunderstanding of Wi-Fi, because in layman's terms, you get your internet signal through a cable that comes in the ground, that goes into your router, and your router gives you a Wi-Fi signal across a certain area. And in this novel, the dome comes down and goes deep into the ground, snaps all the cables going into the town. So Stephen King is doing the kind of typical, possibly middle-aged, possibly old person who doesn't quite understand Wi-Fi, who assumes it all just comes from, through the air, through satellites, like a radio signal or whatever, when in fact cutting off all the wires from the drone would cut off all the internet. But anyway, I think he can be excused for that, because really, who cares? Just sad people like me. Anyway, the next thing I was going to talk about was the ecological themes of this novel, because there are some. It's a little bit of a subtext. It's kind of on the back burner, but I think it's quite effective and quite disturbing, because, like I said earlier, with it's one of these slow burn things in a long novel. Some things are always at the fore, some things are always bubbling low, and some things gradually get more and more significant. And one of them is the whole, like I said, the poisonous air staining the surface of the dome, and it builds and builds and builds, and the air gets dirtier and dirtier. And I found it, I guess, it's quite upsetting seeing these things happen. The other upsetting thing Stephen King does is kill off animals. And people talk about this. I do an English and film course. People talk about it in films. A lot of people, including my tutors, say it's okay, you can kill off however many people in a horror film. I don't give a shit. But as soon as you kill off an animal, like a dog, especially a dog, that's when it becomes upsetting. And without giving too many spoilers, a lot of animals die in this book in rather cruel and upsetting ways, including some pets. The next thing I was going to talk about is this book genre as being an epic, because it's very long and it takes kind of an epic form of this town, and all. It takes into account the whole thing's going all over this town. So I'm going to just list a few things that I think would qualify this book as some kind of epic. So the first thing is the obvious callbacks that are made across it to the film, not the film, sorry, the early Stephen King novel, The Stand. And there's a thing, once you finish the book, I think the first thing that pops up after the last page, if I can find it, bear with me. Yep, right after his little afterword, it says, "If you didn't want the Under the Dome to end, then pick up The Stand, Stephen King's epic novel in its original form, with a foreword by the author himself." I don't know if that's going to show up on this camera. Yeah. So, I think a lot of reviewers did mention this. It's the obvious Stephen King book that gets kind of... It's the obvious one you'd reference having read this. I've not read it myself, but I know it's a post-apocalyptic kind of thing, similar to what's going on in the Dome. There's obvious kind of oppositions between good and evil. Moral issues take a kind of a middle ground, because it's not black and white morals. You see the motivations for the bad guys, you see the flaws of the good guys, but the fact that there are good guys and bad guys says something. So there is some moral complexity in this book, but you always know who you're rooting for, and you always know who you hate. But the good thing is, the villains are well developed, so you'll love to hate them. They are quite detestable people, but some of them are quite interesting. So, yeah, another thing that makes this book epic is its time span. Because you see the size of the book, and as you're reading it, you're thinking perhaps this is occurring over some fairly lengthy period of time, when in fact it only occurs, I think it is, across a week. But the point is, because the cast is so big, because the setting's so big, there's a huge amount going on. So the fact it occurs in 7 days is quite epic, because it's almost every single moment of all those 7 days. Okay, so the next thing that I think makes this quite epic is there's a huge cast. There's families, there's big groups of people, but with that huge cast, it affords Stephen King the opportunity to kill off a huge amount of people. So there's a huge death toll. So like in a TV series, I don't know, like Lost, there's, well, more so than Lost actually, there's always this threat of who's going to die next. And yeah, it's just that punch, isn't it, in the story. So and so's dead, so and so's dead. You hope for the death of the bad guys, and you're afraid of the death of the good guys, and both of them kind of get dished out at a rate which isn't insane, but across the book it keeps you interested, keeps you reading. Another thing that relates to the kind of book's epic credentials is that there's a lot of heroics and a lot of villainy. So as you can imagine, when a town gets isolated by a dome, the best in some people comes out, and the worst in other people comes out. You'll see some characters who heroism kind of comes naturally to them, and you'll obviously root for them when you see them doing the right thing. But I think true to life, the most heroic moments is when people who otherwise would have been cowardly kind of step in to do the right thing. You'll see lots of characters who are afraid to stand out against injustice because they're frightened of the consequences. They're frightened the man in charge will come down on them. So when you see these ordinary, less brave people doing the right thing, those were for me some of the more inspiring kind of feel-good moments of the book. Okay, so another thing that makes this book kind of epic, which is I think anyone who's going to write something about a small town has to do, is gradually all the little secrets come out, because small towns I think have this thing where there's lots of there's secrets that kind of everyone knows, they kind of don't. There's a limited number of secrets because it's a limited population, but there's all these dirty little secrets and all these strange places, and that's the case for the town Under the Dome is set in. And gradually across the novel you'll get the chance to explore all these spaces and all the secrets come out. So you get to find out, for example, who's making the drugs, who's dealing the drugs, who's corrupt, who's not, who lives at so and so, what. Like you'll maybe hear someone be mentioned, like a strange character, and then however many 100 pages in, and then later you'll get to meet that character. Everything, I think it's fair to say, everything that's built up gets paid off, which is cool. HBO, the television station in America that put on all these fantastic television shows, for example, just to name a few new and old, as the current one I'm into is Game of Thrones, but they also did the joint one with the BBC Rome, they did Deadwood, all these kind of morally grey, high production value TV shows. Doubtless everyone who's watching this already knows that, knows what HBO is. They've announced they're going to be making a TV version of this book, which I think will be really good, because it seems like the kind of thing that would translate well to a long-running US TV series, because it's got a great big cast, it's a great big story, there's all kinds of, there's world to explore, there's a lot of complexity, and it's broken down quite episodically as well in the book, so unless they completely duff that up, I think it will make a pretty great TV show. So I'm excited about that. I'll probably find a way to watch it. So the next thing I was going to talk about was this book's credentials as a story about community, because I think that's largely what it's about, is this how this town functions for the better and for the worse as a group, as a community. So I thought I'd talk about community by comparing the community in Under the Dome to the representation of the community in a few others of the Stephen King books I've read. So I'll start by comparing it to Salem's Lot. So in Salem's Lot, we have a small town in roughly the same part of the world who also suffer a blight. They have some vampires move into town, and like the corruption that starts to take place in Under the Dome, they experience their own corruption. Basically, they all start to get turned into monsters themselves. But I think the big difference, and the difference that lends complexity to Under the Dome, is in Salem's Lot, your good guys end up being quite fast, similar to the good guys who we have in Dracula. So we have a small band of people who know what's going on and know how to deal with the bad guys and take them down. So basically it becomes very quickly a big group of them and a small group of us. Whereas in Under the Dome, we have a community that never quite breaks down into us and them. We have a few bad guys who are in charge, a large silent majority who either go along with what's going on or don't act out of fear, and then we have a small, increasingly growing band of goodies who want to deal with the bad stuff that's going on. So I think, not to discount Salem's Lot, but if you want a deeper kind of, well, if you want a book that deals with community in a bit more depth, I'd recommend Under the Dome over Salem's Lot. The second book I was going to talk about that deals with community that I've read by Stephen King is Bag of Bones, which has some similar things going on to it that Under the Dome does. I think this pops up in a lot of Stephen King's books. There's He has a fear of the community, but he also has a belief in the community, which is, I'm sure, something we all experience. On one hand, I'm sure you're all familiar with how sometimes in groups of people, the worst of us comes out. The dumb people are the ones who have the loudest voices, or are the ones who are obnoxious enough to take control, and then the majority of other people have a tendency to, hop on the bandwagon or be afraid of people who are different, of minorities. We've seen that. I'm sure you've seen that in your own lives. It's been seen across history. So we see that. That pops up in this book as the sinister, rather nasty people start to take control of town. And it pops up in Bag of Bones, where I think we have a writer who comes to this little town in Maine regularly. But one of the big figures in town is a rather nasty fellow who takes a dislike to our main character, and very easily turns these ordinary Maine people into a hostile force. So I think if you've read Bag of Bones, you might agree with me. The fear of ordinary people turning nasty really fast is something that pops up in Bag of Bones, pops up in Under the Dome. But at the same time, Under the Dome has a belief in the community. Bag of Bones has it as well, a belief that at least a small number of people have it in them to stand up and do the right thing and take it to its conclusion, take down the baddie, which if you're going to have a happy ending, kind of requires. And I think in Under the Dome, there's a bit more optimism in more than just a few people, more than just our main character coming together to sort out the bad juju collectively, or at least having the balls to try. Anyway, so the third one, I think this is the most interesting comparison to talk about in terms of community, is the novel Stephen King wrote From a Buick 8, which is a story where a haunted car shows up in a small town. I don't think it's in Maine, I think it's in a more southern location, but still it's in a small town. And the police appropriate this car and keep it as a little secret between themselves, and don't let anyone on that this creepy haunted car has showed up. And to figure out how to write about a police force, Stephen King researched police in a small town, and he came to sympathise with them, so we can understand what makes the police tick. How do you understand how they think about their job? So I suppose the obvious thing a horror writer writing about community might do is villainize the police, but obviously we know Stephen King understands the humanity of a police force, knows they're not just pigs or monsters or whatever. But the police force in Under the Dome are incredibly important. If you look through the list of the cast that Stephen King provides to help you familiarise yourself with all the residents in town, you'll see, I'll hold it up here, I'll point out the police force, that's them there. It's a pretty huge chunk of the cast is in the town's police department, and the reason they're important is the politician who takes power in the town after the dome comes down basically uses the police as his what you might call Gestapo, well not Gestapo, basically armed thugs to get his way. And as you might expect, having researched the police force, Stephen King doesn't villainize the force itself, he just shows how there can be a dark side to policing in small towns. If the wrong people get in power, good policing goes out the window and the thugs take over. And yeah, basically as the corruption in the town gets worse, you see the police force becoming a darker and darker kind of organisation, because basically the man who's running it is the man who's in charge of the town, who just wants to use the police as thugs to his own ends. And you have this situation where, like under any kind of totalitarian system, it's not the good people who do their jobs good who get promoted and stay in the force, it's the people who obey without question. The book's not really even about the dome, it's just about what happens when one town gets trapped on its own and how the community reacts. So next thing I'd like to say, along a similar line to community, is to do with the power dynamics of small towns, because that's something this book deals with. As power shifts more and more and more into the hands of the villain, you see how he uses, or how he is subverted by various kind of typical institutions that you'd see in a small town. So you have the church. There's two churches in this town. This town whose name I should probably look up. Chester's Mill. I should have looked that up way earlier. So in Chester's Mill there's two churches. They've basically just split into the good church and the bad church. There's a fundamentalist church which is attached to the villain. It's where the stupid bad people go. And there's I forget which branch of the church it is, but there's another church where basically your more ordinary people will go, where the minister is much better adjusted. And I suppose that represents a pretty common sense way of how ordinary smart people would understand churches in the world. There's the normal ones where the normal people go, and there's the small minority of crazy ones who speak awfully loud. I'm sure people in America might know what I'm talking about. Then there's the police. Like I've already talked about the police, but basically, once again, there's only one police force in this town, but we have a fairly clear split between good officers and bad officers. Most of them obey their orders, but we see the split between people who fall on the ones who obey mindlessly and take pleasure from abusing their authority with no consequences, and the police who want to just be good police but have their job problematized by the fact that the police force isn't very good anymore. So anyway, the next big institution that features in the small town's kind of power dynamics is the town council, and this is very important. The three kind of political positions the local government of Chester's Mill seems to have is they're called selectmen. Maybe if you live in Maine or America or whatever, you know what a selectman is. It's a new concept to me. But there's three. I don't know if that shows up. Yeah, those top three names. So the dynamics of the small town council is apparently, according to Stephen King, supposed to mirror George Bush and Cheney during the Bush administration, where basically your man in charge is a clueless, fairly well-meaning guy, and his second in command is the ruthless, kind of behind the scenes, kind of really just the man in charge type figure, who is ruthless, opinionated, and rather good at getting his way. Hello, I'm performing my review of Under the Dome.
Oh, you recorded?
Yeah. Do you know anything about Stephen King? Do you want to contribute?
Oh, no. His films are great.
What films have you seen?
Dreamcatcher, that wasn't very good.
No. Dreamcatcher's a bit weird.
I've seen Green Mile.
Green Mile.
I like that very much.
Yeah. Stephen King, I think some of Stephen King's best stuff is not horror stuff.
Misery. And you're quite right, his best stuff
is
the film part anyway.
Yeah. There's a lot of good Stephen King films.
Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah. Everyone likes Shawshank Redemption. Okay. Where was I? Oh yeah. So the next thing, I don't know if you can call it an institution, and I don't know if every small town has them, but in Chester's Mill there's drug dealing going on, which is, once again, it's just another thing used by this guy Jim Rennie, the big man, to exert some kind of control over the town and to make money. So yeah, the drug of choice in Chester's Mill is meth, crystal meth, which I suppose is fairly current. So the next institution that appears is the press, and this is quite interesting. I think what Stephen King's doing with the press in this small town is making a reverse straw man. So a straw man is where you present your opponent yourself, but because it's a straw man, you can make your opponent look as silly as you fancy for your own ends. And what I would call a reverse straw man is where you present kind of the opposite of your own opinion, but for the sake of being polite or appearing to be open-minded, you make your opponent look a little bit more reasonable than perhaps they are. So Stephen King is a kind of a lefty, liberal type fellow, but obviously dealing with small towns, if there's press there, I suppose in America it's quite likely they're going to be Republican. So there's a small newspaper publisher in his little town, Chester's Mill, and kind of blurring the line between the political, I don't know, the two teams in America. It's a Republican newspaper, but it's called the Democrat, which the name doesn't signify anything, but right in your mind there is immediate blurring between these two supposed opposites. And the character that runs this newspaper, Julia Shonway, never really seems to me to be particularly, conservative or exhibiting anything I would have thought of as being what a Republican would be in America. And he calls attention to that. His main character, Dale Barbara, is constantly calling attention to the fact that the more he gets to know Julia, the less Republican she seems. But yeah, I think Stephen King is trying to be even-handed or polite or whatever you want to call it, but it's a very PC representation of someone who would, or an institution that would be opposed to his own views. But kudos to him, I suppose. Good for him. Right. So, the next thing I was going to talk about was a neat little subtext in On the Dome. There seem to be, to me, allusions to Nazi Germany and the rise of Hitler in this book. If you know your history of Weimar Germany, you'll maybe pick up on some things that happened in Germany leading up to the rise of the Nazis. There's staged riots and there's staged fires, and that's quite significant because the Nazi Party, historically, basically, they didn't just play on the kind of public violence as kind of manufacturing or playing on people's desire for them to be some kind of end to chaos. They didn't just take advantage of these things, they created them. They would participate in fights, pick fights with their parties to create a sense of there being violence which needed to be controlled with some kind of order. And more controversially, there was a big fire in the German Parliament building, the equivalent of Congress in America or whatever you happen to have in your own country, called the Reichstag, where it caught fire and burned down. And the official story is that a communist did it, a Dutchman I think it was. But some people theorise that it was actually the Nazis that did it. And there's a similar thing, there's a fire in Chester's Mill, which is in fact started by the villains. But only a limited number of people actually find out the villains did start it. And it's only ever, for most people, a suspicion that perhaps the villain, Big Jim, started this fire for his own end. So I think this is, I'm pretty sure Stephen King knows his history. This seems like a deliberate allusion to me. So that's interesting. But there's other stuff which you don't need to know your history for. It seems to be it is an allusion to Nazi Germany. So obviously you have the obsession with power with the villain, the growing police brutality. There's a lot of talk of scapegoating. Our villain, Jim Rennie, knows you need scapegoats if you're going to convince people to hand away their freedoms to you. They need to have someone to victimize if they're going to believe in you. And also the word brown shirts is dropped a few times. People who don't trust the kind of growing, basically the thugs who find themselves in power thanks to Jim Rennie, they get referred to as brown shirts. So yeah, those are all the allusions to Nazi Germany in this book. So quickly, I'm going to talk about not quickly at all. I'm going to talk about my favourite characters in this book, because there's some really good ones. So my favourite character is, actually just about all my favourite characters are the villains. So my favourite character was Junior. Junior is the son of Big Jim Rennie, the big villain. Jim's a young man who starts off being a rather nasty character. Things go wrong for him quite badly. His story is quite dark and surreal. So basically, the opening of the novel, he murders a couple of young women and begins to suffer headaches. And he tries to cover up these murders, but at the same time, his migraines become worse and worse. He has this dark spot in his eye that gradually gets bigger and bigger, and he gets crazier and crazier. I think his character is one of the best developed in the book, and the fact that he's the son of the villain becomes quite important. They have to work together to hide one another's crimes, and they have this kind of father-son love-hate dynamic that's really cool. And there was one thing I could criticise in this book. It would be that I wanted to see this come to more of a head, but it never quite gets a chance to. Unfortunately, I really would have liked to have seen Junior face down his dad. It never quite happens though. So my second favourite character is a guy called the Chef, who is the man that operates the production of the drugs in town. And the drugs are made, or the front of the drugs is the town's Christian radio station. And this man seems to live alone at this radio station. He has the most amazing introduction of any character I've ever read into a novel. So a few characters go to investigate this radio station and find no one there. And it's got a very eerie kind of mood. It's like in Lost, when the characters go to visit one of the hatches. It's incredibly eerie. There's a sense that it's still running with no one being there, but maybe people have just left. So anyway, our heroes, or our characters who are visiting, leave the building, and just as they're leaving, the chef, who has taken up residence here, creeps out of a hidden door, and the description of him is fantastic. He's described, I think it's his hip bones, because he's incredibly skinny, because he's on the always drug. His hip bones or his shoulder blades or something are described as being like wings. I just thought that sounded really cool. He kind of gets normalised more and more. He's a very strange guy, but he starts off incredibly otherworldly and becomes a bit less of a mystery. But this first description of him is very foreboding, very otherworldly. But he gradually becomes more and more kind of darkly likeable. He's a bit of a... Although he's making drugs, he doesn't quite fit in with his villainous bosses. He grates against them, and this comes to a head in a really cool way. And he goes out not as a good guy at all, but a bit of a badass, a bit of a likeable kind of anti-hero, I think. So my third favourite character is also a villain. It's Big Jim, and this is a classic kind of you love to hate him type villain. We spend a lot of time with them. Various characters are written in third person from various characters' perspectives, but Big Jim gets quite a lot of time devoted to him. And across the novel you really get inside his head. He's quite a simple man, so he's only got a limited number of tics, things that make him angry, and he only thinks about a very limited amount of things. He's always thinking about how he can get more power and how he can get rid of people under him who are threatening to take away his power. So it's kind of claustrophobic. You learn what he's like pretty fast, and then you live with him, and then you wait and really hope he gets killed. And I won't give any spoilers, but yeah, you just always have your fingers crossed that he'll eventually get what's coming to him. But it's a long book, so you do have to wait a while before you find out what happens to him in the end. So my fourth favourite character is the hero, basically the guy who gets set up to be our lead heroic amazing man. He's called Dale Barber, and I think he's a lot like, to reference Lost again, he's a lot like the character Jack from Lost. So early on he's posited as our big hero. He's the guy who seems to be able to do no wrong. But is that a bit boring? I'm sure a lot of readers felt the same. That it's too obvious for him to be doing all the good in a cast of so many characters, and sure enough, a bit like Jack from Lost, he gradually gets disempowered more and more and more, and as things get bigger, they get too big for him. And the other good characters, the community itself, kind of takes over, which I think is really cool, because it's a book about community, and it doesn't always make sense when you're dealing with a big cast to have one guy who saves the day. So basically, the people who he ends up inspiring to do the right thing start doing his job for him. Like, I won't give any spoilers, but by the end of the novel, Barbara is just one cog in a machine of a big group of the people who kind of collectively are our hero, which I think is pretty good writing on Stephen King's part, because it would have been easy to just constantly have deal with Barbara solving every problem, but to have a cast of characters all doing small parts that contribute to a greater whole, I think is very cool. So the other character I really liked, I'd like to talk about really quickly, is there's a little corgi dog, and there's a few dogs in the book, but we have a couple of really brief moments in the novel where we see things from the corgi's perspective. And I don't know if Stephen King's done this before, but he's really good at telling you how a dog does things and sees things. And I'm getting me to drink of water. But it was really cool seeing a corgi dog in a novel, because I'm from the UK, and if you hear the words corgi dog, you'll think of the Queen, because one of her quirks is that she owns a number of corgi dogs. So you think of them as being royal, exclusive, not very normal. But in the book, Stephen King kind of normalises corgi dogs as something anyone could own. And he describes them as having great big cheesy grins, and I could just picture that really well, so I like that. Anyway, I'm going to talk about my favourite scenes from this book before I finish. So one scene a lot of other people who've done reviews talk about is, I think, one of the very first scenes, where there's a wee woodchuck, I think it is, who's walking along just outside the edge of this town, Chester's Mill, just as the dome comes down, and he's having an okay time. He sees a human, he's a bit nervous, and he keeps on walking, and then the dome comes down and cuts the little woodchuck in half, and it goes from being quite a little, it really gets you inside the little creature's head very effectively, like he did with the corgi, and then the animal's dead. And it's quite jarring. It's because it brings you in so well into something, into the mindset of an animal you think you'd never get into, and you're quite enjoying being there, and then the animal's dead. So my other favourite scenes are the numerous scenes which my favourite character, Junior, is in, particularly as he gets more crazy. He starts to have hallucinations and stuff. There's one really cool bit where he's getting a bit annoyed with someone, and he's just putting up with them having the conversation. Then all of a sudden the book says, pulls out a gun, blows the guy's head off, and you're sitting there really like, whoa, you just killed the guy. And then the book jumps again, and it really quickly says that Junior realised he must have just imagined shooting the guy in the head, and the conversation continues. And I thought that was fantastic. It just you're reading along, you're maybe in the zone, forgetting about it, just taking it all in, and you get thrown right out of the book by that shock, and then you get taken back in. Hello.